Well, hello and welcome. You're watching Tech at Work, and I am Ashmit Kumar. Now, 2024 was the year of artificial intelligence. Every major company jumped on the bandwagon and announced their large language models. Now, governments and institutions alike across the globe are attempting to integrate into the technology to improve efficiency. But with the rapid adoption, there are growing calls for regulations. Now, to boost this opportunity and to tackle risks and uncertainties, an advisory body formed by the UN Secretary General has recommended forming a global authority on AI. It also proposed regular intergovernmental discussions to share the best practices to govern AI. But how can we strike the right balance between innovation and safety? I think that's one key question that's guiding conversations, not just here in India, but across the world. We will see the regulations on AI gather steam in 2025. That's another question being asked. To answer this and more, I'm now joined by Ambassador Amandeep Gill, a technology envoy for UN Secretary General, Mr. Sharad Sharma, co-founder of iSPIRT Foundation, and Ms. Astha Kapoor, co-founder of Aapti Institute. Thank you so much for taking our time, for coming all the way to our Noida studio. It's encouraging to host you here in our new studio. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Let me begin by taking the first question with you, Ambassador. In October 2023, a high-level committee was formed. 11 months later, in September last year, you came out with this report. I think the one message that, at least between stakeholders, has gathered momentum is that any isolated governance framework will not work. This is a distributed technology. We need a distributed governance system. Is that the message that came to you when you came out with this report in September last year, that we need more global cooperation for building a global framework, a global governance framework?
Absolutely. So this is a very powerful technology. Its implications extend beyond the private sector, the economic dimension, to political, social, cultural dimensions. And it affects people everywhere. So everyone must be part of the governance effort. That's why the report of this advisory body was titled Governing AI for Humanity. So if the benefits are concentrated in a few geographies, in a few companies, and if the burdens, the risks are unfairly loaded on to some others, then we have a very unfair situation. And to address that, the first step, the fundamental step, is to bring everyone into the conversation on the governance of these technologies.
I think that's one interesting observation, that heading into 2025, we're talking about bringing everyone together. Mr. Sharma, let me come to you. When we talk of bringing everyone together, all the stakeholders together, I'll just borrow from a study which came out just a couple of days back, which is the WEF report. It talked about how international cooperation has stagnated over the last 12 months. They've cited uncertainty, geopolitical tensions, risks of conflict. In this atmosphere, how viable it is and how feasible it is in 2025? Do you see that happening? That despite the conflict, you have countries coming together at a consensus on governing AI. Do you see that happening?
Yes, I think this report itself is a product of such kind of consensus that emerged. And I think Ambassador was the sutradhar for kind of bringing everybody together. And he was masterful in kind of drawing out the synergies and even the differences, so that you could please discuss them openly and come to some kind of consensus. So I think it is possible. It is effortful, as it should be, but it is definitely feasible. Having said that, I think there are many opinions that are there. And I think for a change, India has a very clear position on what it wants to see happen in the digital AI world, which is informed by its own domestic needs. And I think, increasingly, both India and the world are waking up to the fact that if we can make it work in India, if it works in India, it will work anywhere in the world, right? So I think these experiments that India is doing will inform global thinking as well as we deploy them and see whether they work or not.
I think a lot of interesting insights, a lot of conversations in India in terms of how to go about this aspect of governance. But before we head into the India example and the India model, I just want to address the elephant in the room. The Trump presidency is just a few days away. January 20th is what many people are referring to as the day where the dynamics of international conversations will change. What's also interesting is that he's flanked by Elon Musk, who, of course, is very vocal, has strong views on this technology and how it is to be governed going forward. This combine, Trump and Musk put together, what does that do to the conversation on governance, especially when there are strong views not just on AI by Donald Trump and Musk, but also on China? What does that do to this conversation on governance? I leave that open to the panel. You want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, in the middle of this panel, but I think that there's a unique opportunity for India as well as the Global South to take a leadership position in that. I think that technology is one of the things that is experienced pretty equally across the world, whether it's the harms or the opportunities from it. And I think that what we're seeing, we're having this conversation a few days after the DPDP rules have come out. There's a new guideline for AI governance that's also come out in India. Several other countries are also working towards their own governance frameworks. So, yes, it will be disruptive, absolutely. But I think it's also an opportunity to crack open some of these conversations and create a multipolarity around the governance of this. And I think it's a huge opportunity for India, which is data rich, it's eager to govern, it has a lot of innovation potential, and the conversation around, the fact that we are the cradle of humanity, to steal one of Sharad's phrases, is that I think that there's a lot of opportunity for us to take a leadership role. So yes, disruptive, but also potentially an opportunity.
Disruptive. I think focusing on a few individuals, one or two countries, it disempowers the rest of the world, because this is about the entire humanity. And the Global South in particular needs to be able to harness AI to leapfrog some of its development challenges. And we also need to work together to address the risk, the downside of it, to our opportunities to work, to how creative content is protected and used, to misinformation, disinformation. Also, the powerful reshaping of relationships and channels of communication that generative AI represents. So this is not an issue for just a few companies or one or two countries. It's for entire humanity. And in India, we say Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the entire world is my family. So you can't just sit behind national borders. These are problems without passports, whether it's climate change or the governance of AI.
But this is a problem that I suspect will also come up in Davos, is when Davos will be coinciding, WEF, World Economic Forum, will be coinciding with President Trump taking charge. Again, same question to you. What does that do to the conversation, the Donald Trump, Elon Musk combine? Does it add more volatility? Does it make your job more difficult when you're trying to build consensus between countries?
I can't comment as to what they're going to do, and how that's going to play out. But I think one of clearly, and the US has many voices, right? And Elon Musk is on one side, there are many others on the other side, even with respect to AI regulation. And the question, of course, is how do we connect with that? I think one common ground that emerges between the Donald Trump, Elon Musk camp is their primacy on the family. And therefore, that is something that's very close to India's heart. So it is quite possible that in those areas, our thinking will actually move faster than would be the case otherwise.
Sure.
But also, there are issues of, we are in the world of tech Cold War, and technology is a source of national power, and how that will be asserted may be very different as we go forward. So I think it's an unknown, but if anybody can deal with the chaos that is going to be there, with this change, I think it is us Indians. We don't get fazed by these kind of changes very easily, and I think we'll navigate it as we go forward without too much of a problem.
Let's bring India into the conversation. One of the aspects that was a part of this report in September 2024, which in fact managed to strike a chord with the voices coming in from the regulatory mechanism here in India, is the concentration of this technology in a few hands. The concerns that were expressed by the RBI governor. He talked about while the industry here is encouraged to take on this new technology, the concern is if this technology is concentrated only a few hands, that raises systemic risks. Ambassador, I'll come to you. We were discussing just moments earlier as to what this does to the dynamic of competition what this does in terms of a more democratic distribution of the AI technology? How do we address this concentration of AI on only a few hands in a few tech companies?
So the fortunate element with the advisory body's report was it landed in time for the adoption of the Global Digital Compact at the Summit of the Future, the United Nations. So its recommendations have landed in decisions by all the 193 member states of the UN. And among those decisions is precisely this issue which you highlighted. How do we address this growing AI divide, ensure that the opportunities spread more evenly? So there is going to be an international scientific panel that spreads knowledge of these capabilities around the world, reduce information asymmetries, a place for learning from each other, for sharing of what works, what doesn't work within the UN, the inclusive setting of the UN, and importantly, an effort to build capacity around the world and facilitate access to the key enablers of AI development, data, compute, talent, backed by funding, by predictable funding, potentially through a global fund on AI. So these are critical foundational decisions. If we can implement them in 2025, we reduce the possibility of a very unequal AI world in the future.
That's an interesting question. Another issue that is always spoken of has been the issue of IP, the issue of privacy. I think that is one issue where we don't really have a clear answer how to go about it. And I'm talking about how public data, which is protected by copyright, can it be used for training models? This is a question that has come up before the Delhi High Court. A newswire, ANI, has filed a suit against OpenAI. OpenAI conceded that they have as many as 16 suits across the world. Ms. Kapoor, let me come to you. When we are addressing these questions, how do we go about finding an answer to this? Because we don't really have one. Should AI models be allowed to train on these copyright-protected information and public information? How do we go about it? Because we have the DPDP, but it only protects personal data.
Yeah. I think the question of non-personal data or data that is, in the context of ANI or even New York Times, which is also a suit pending for OpenAI, I think these are things that are being considered. It's not simple. Some of the frameworks, such as sweat of the brow, that we used to consider in the context of intellectual property don't apply to AI. And OpenAI and other training models have been quite extractive. They have been sending their trollers all over the internet, and there are lots of ways in which the internet is fighting back. So people are putting up defenses on their website to prevent training data or models to come through. I think this is something that is, going to need a new framework and something that is going to require a much more complex set of answers than the ones that, age-old copyright and IP frameworks have allowed us. I think that this is a question of value. Who is extracting the value and where is the value getting concentrated? Who is making, at the end of the day, money from the data that is being it's being trained on, and how do you redistribute that? So what are the sort of ways in which models that are being trained on, say, public data, how can they redistribute value? To give you an example, if models are being trained on, say, public data on traffic, for instance, in the city of Delhi, how do we give back the value of that data to citizens or to other, smaller companies that are building on mobility in the city?
Sure.
So there may be newer models. It may not be within the framework of intellectual property as we understand it.
It's interesting. I think a number of questions there, which again circle back to the need for perhaps a global consensus and global cooperation. We will take now a small break. We're slipping into a very short commercial break. But on the other side, we'll come back and we'll try to find answers to these questions in terms of governance for AI in 2025. Stay with us. Welcome back to Tech at Work. We still have with us Ambassador Amandeep Gill, Sharad Sharma, as well as Astha Kapoor. Thank you so much for being with us. Mr. Sharma, let me come to you. We were trying to find answers to some of these tricky questions. EU seems to have found an answer. They've come out with an AI-based legislation. They seem to have a risk-based approach, which is to say that if, say, there's a Gen AI model that produces videos that's potentially more risky and therefore invites a higher threshold of regulatory action as compared to, say, an AI tech that helps you pick whether to have biryani or butter chicken tonight. So making that distinction, that risk-based approach, that's the answer that EU has. Is that the same approach that you find working in other geographies as well? Do you see that working here? Does India have a different answer?
Yeah, so different countries are shaped by their past to figure out a way to implement the same set of principles. I think the principle that we must keep AI safe for a common citizen, I think is a common principle that is accepted everywhere. In the US, the thinking is that we could do that by labeling the AI appropriately. You know, they're inspired by their food labels. And they say if you label well, then it's the onus is on the person who's consuming that AI. In Europe, they are focused on making sure that there are enough testing that is done, you know, for models that are released in the public. They are inspired by what they did with car safety, right? In India, we have a more diagonal approach, which is to say that there is a chain involved in AI, which starts where the end product may be a deepfake video, but behind that is an application, behind the application is a model, behind the model is training data, and we should know what that chain is, and we can then intervene at whatever may be the appropriate point in the chain to keep our citizens safe. So this approach of what is called as an AI chain is a uniquely Indian approach. The Indian thinking is bold and bullish on it, simply because we've implemented such a chain for taxation, indirect taxation, GST, very successfully, right? It works better than anybody imagined. So therefore, I think the principles are common, but how they will get deployed are different. The other variation that is there in India is this concept of techno-legal regulation. So ultimately, you are shaping market behavior. In the West, shaping market behavior by regulation alone is sufficient. Thou shall have a license only once you have a driving test. That's the regulation. What do you think? Does everybody follow that regulation? The answer is yes. What do you think is the case here in Noida? If you go out, does everybody follow that? No, it doesn't. So therefore, in India, the thinking has been that you need two hands to guide the market behavior. You need public policy, but you also need public technology. So therefore, it's only when both come together that you get the outcomes that you seek. India has been using that very aggressively, and it is called techno-legal regulation. And that is part of the report itself. So this is a concept of regulation that is being exported from India to other parts of the world in a very serious way. So India has its own story to tell about how AI shall be regulated. Now, now this is not theory, because some of it has worked. For example, EU has GDPR, and there's a debate whether it's been successful or not. Sure. India has the same principle, but reflected as the account aggregator. That was a fairly large pilot that was done just with financial data. That pilot is successful. We have already got more than 100 million consents. The sense is that it's worked by and large. And so therefore the DPDP Act brings that to life and extends it to all sectors, right? So therefore there are these variations that you will see.
I think that's a wonderful explanation of techno-legal regulation. If anyone didn't understand that, I think the Noida example would have explained that to them. Ms. Kapoor, let me come to you now. In terms of taking these baby steps forwards, we've seen the DPDP Act in 2023, then subsequently we have the rules now with us. We had the MeitY guidelines as well on AI governance. Is there more that needs to be done? We're nowhere near a Digital India Act that talks about AI regulation, but we're beginning to get some color on what that may look like. What indication does that give you in terms of more support coming in from a techno-legal perspective?
So I think, like you said, like some color within the lines, but a lot needs to be done. And obviously, we've lost time as well with the DPDP for all of us who were waiting for many years. But I think that the techno-legal approach has some opportunity for particularly the mass of the users, right? What we are seeing in our work is that people have high levels of distrust with technology. So you're seeing a lot of people with phones, but usage when it comes to financial payments, when it comes to, anything more than social media, which actually makes meaningful users, is very low. Because we've not been able to communicate trust in technology meaningfully. And what something like a techno-legal approach, can do is that it can provide a very visual as well as tech-coded instantiation of safeguards in the same way that we have, the car won't start till you put on the seat belt. We will not be able to do a few things on an application if you don't have the requisite safeguards. And I think that's the kind of agency that people need on platforms, as well as the reassurance to build trust. And that's where some of the techno-legal aspects are very, very interesting. What's important is that the legal takes time. So we need to think about what the sort of base of regulation is supposed to be. And I think in that, some participatory approaches which can, make sure that we have relevant direction while we regulate is also necessary. So yes, for the techno-legal approach, but we cannot wait 8 years for law.
That, in fact, was my very next question, that the digital protection conversation began in 2017 with the Supreme Court verdict. It's taken us time now till 2025. How long do we need to wait, or do we need a piece of legislation and AI legislation in India immediately? What is the answer?
Please.
In this techno-legal approach, in India, the public technology piece usually ends up coming first. And the public policy or the legal piece comes later. And that's not a bad way of doing things. Okay. Because today, for example, the public technology for regulating AI, which is called DPI for AI, is not launched for public, but there are significant pilots that are taking place, right? Oh. And now what will happen from that is that you'll learn what works and what doesn't work. And because India is so complex, what works in Bangalore may not work in another place. And so you begin to develop a much more informed view. So take the DPDP Act itself. As the account aggregator pilot progressed, a draft of the law that had been already passed by the JPC was then set aside and replaced by a 35-page document, right, which is generally received good feedback. So the reason that happened was that there had been field learning that had happened in a financial space with hundreds of millions of people using it. So I think the Indian model is not a bad model. And I think, we should... all I want to assure you is that this DPI for AI part is well in the field, being tried out at scale with sizable pilots. And we will have to wait perhaps for the end of the year to see how they go. And if they go well, then to have complementary and enabling legislation to allow that to scale for the whole of the country and for perhaps even other parts of the world becomes a very sensible.
But let me then just ask a supplementary question. For a government that is quick to point and flag the risks of AI, how safe is it from a safety standpoint, from a harms standpoint, to work without a piece of legislation?
I think the government has taken a very good approach of saying, let's not rush to regulate. But at the same time, particularly for children, I think there is a concern that we must regulate for children, whether we regulate for adults or not. And so therefore, in the DPDP rules itself, as many people may have noticed, very good provisions for children, age-related rules have been already included. So it is not as if there's nothing happening. I think there is a two-tier kind of an approach. First is protect the children, and then come back and protect the adults. So that's the approach.
If I may jump in, this depends strongly on context. India has a very mature technical community, so it can lead with public tech. That may not be the case in other countries. Yeah. So their legislation may have to lead the way.
Sure.
So the different stakeholders may be in a different geometry in different places. So different contexts will... What we need at the international level is a space where all these different approaches can be shared so that different jurisdictions can learn from each other and build the right approach that works in their context, based on the principles that are there in the UN Charter and other international...
We're completely out of time, Ambassador, but I'll just come to you for a quick final closing comment. We began this conversation about the need for global cooperation. Why the UN at this point is, as per you, best suited to bring about that global cooperation? We have a varied sense of stakeholders. You have US on one hand, countries like China on the other, then countries like India that are looking to take the lead in terms of techno-legal regulation. Why UN is ideally positioned for bringing about this global cooperation?
Because everyone is there. All these players that you mentioned, it's the most inclusive forum on planet Earth. and because it is based in the UN Charter and a set of shared legal arrangements that have been developed over decades. Now, as we discuss, new law, new treaty making, that takes time in this space. So why don't we rely on what already exists so that we can protect everyone, we can advance on the Sustainable Development Goals. Those are the advantages of the UN, and we have the decisions from the Summit of the Future for the foundations of AI governance. Let's start implementing them.
Ambassador, thank you so much for your comments and sharing your time with us. Ms. Kapoor, Mr. Sharma, thank you so much for sharing that insight. A lot of these questions, hopefully, we'll get answers as we move forward in 2025, but we're not short of uncertainty or volatility. I think as the year rolls on, as we near the Jan 20th date, perhaps that's when we'll begin to get more color on what the rest of the year may look like. But that, unfortunately, is all the time that we have. It's a wrap on this edition of Tech at Work. Stay tuned to CNBC TV 18 for more news and updates.